I'm Nicole Austin-Hillery, and I'm the director and counsel of the Brennan Center's Washington, D.C. office, where all those fun guys and gals are in that pretty white building, and they're trying to pass laws and make the nation better. And I get to spend lots of time with them. I'm so pleased today to be here with Danielle. One of the things that we do at the Brennan Center, as you heard my colleague Brian mention, is we really try to fix those broken parts of our systems of justice and democracy. And we really feel strongly that one of the most broken parts of our systems of justice is our criminal justice system here in the United States. So when Danielle's book, Cuz, came out, our president, Michael Waldman, immediately said, we have got to get her here to talk about this book and to talk about these issues. So we are so pleased, Danielle, to have you with us today.
It's an honor, thank you. I was saying before we were chatting a little bit beforehand that the Brennan Center is such a beacon of hope in a very bleak landscape. It is a true privilege to have the chance to talk with you and to learn more about your work as a part of this conversation also. But just 3 cheers for the Brennan Center. We're so grateful for everything you do.
Thank you, and we will share that with all of our colleagues. I often tell them, Danielle, that because I'm in Washington and I'm doing meetings all the time, I get to hear all of the, oh, you all are so wonderful, while they're back, in New York doing hard research and crunching numbers. So I always share that with them. So we will be certain to do that. For those of you who don't know Danielle's background, just let me give you a little brief intro to her background, and then we really want to get into the discussion about the book and about Danielle's thoughts on our criminal justice system. Danielle is both a classics scholar and a political scientist. She's a university professor at Harvard, where she teaches and writes books, and she's also a Washington Post columnist, where she writes about politics and ethics. She's a graduate of Princeton, Cambridge, and Harvard, and she is chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board.
Used to be.
Okay. My notes didn't say that, but I think you can say that all the time, Danielle. It's kind of like once you're a senator, always a senator.
There we go. All right.
So there you go.
Steve.
All of that is super impressive, but I have to tell you, I don't think there's anything more impressive than this book that you wrote, Danielle. And I really want to talk about the book in 3 parts, because I think it's not just about your cousin Michael. It's also about his journey, but it's also about family and what it means for families when you have a relative who runs into this kind of life-changing, life-altering experience. What are the obligations of family?
Right.
And what is the role of family to help change that trajectory? And then finally, it's a conversation about the entire criminal justice system in the United States.
Yes.
Are we a system that is simply focused on punishment versus rehabilitation? And what does that mean in terms of what kind of nation of young people we are creating?
Right.
And what are the disparities involved in that system? Because we know, looking at the statistics, there is a larger number of young African-American men who are arrested and jailed than any other group in the United States. And that's a problem. And what does that mean for our democracy in our country? So why don't you quickly tell us, start the conversation by telling us what led you to this book and what's at the heart of it?
Sure. So the book is called Cuz, and as you can imagine, that means cousin, and it also means because. And it's about my baby cousin, Michael, who was arrested in Los Angeles in 1995 at age 15 on a first arrest for an attempted carjacking. And the only good thing about this incident is that the only person who got hurt in it was Michael. And that's a sort of terrible thing to say. You're sort of grateful that your cousin got hurt, but the fact that he didn't hurt anybody, I'm grateful for. And as he was taken to the ambulance to the hospital, should we swap out the mics? Thanks. He confessed that he had also robbed 3 people the previous day and somebody else a week earlier. There had been nothing like that in his history, so it was a spree without any question, but it also came from nowhere. And this was about 18 months after California had passed the 3 strikes, you're out law. So he was facing 4 felony charges, 2 for the attempted carjacking, because he'd asked for the watch and the wallet, and so that was 1 felony, and then he'd asked for the car, so that was a second separate felony, and then 2 of the robberies he'd confessed to. And so he was told, look, you've confessed to these things, you go to trial, it's going to be 4 felonies, it'll be 25 years to life. That was the penalty for 3 strikes versus for a first arrest. So he pled guilty, and he got a 13-year sentence, and served 11 years. And I spent a lot of time talking on the phone with him, spent a lot of time working with him on college courses, doing correspondence courses and so forth, and trying to turn what was not a rehabilitative experience inside that prison into a rehabilitative experience. And he got out when he was 26. So he was in from 15 to 26, grew up, in other words, in prison. And I was what I always just call sort of the cousin on duty when he got out. So I was a professional by that point. I was in this big extended family that we were this sort of subset of cousins that had grown up together. And I was one of the ones who had the resources of time and money to help. So on this issue of family obligations. So I was there when he was released, and it was sort of my job to be with him day after day in those early months, working on getting a job, getting into school, figuring out housing, and so forth. And Michael's story ends 3 years after he was first released, when he was shot and killed by the transgender girlfriend that he'd fallen in love with when he was in prison. He fell in love for real. It was a real love story. It was a love story with a terrible end. And so he died in 2009. And so you might think, well, okay, why is it taken so long to talk about this or to tell the story or to write about it? Here we are 8 years later. And so the answer to that question is basically Henry Louis Gates Jr. at Harvard, fantastic scholar of English literature and American history, African American history, invited me years ago actually to give a series of lectures at Harvard called the Du Bois Lectures. And you all know W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the greatest intellectuals of American history, early 20th century, African American sociologist, who taught us to think about life behind the veil, African American experience in the US and so forth. And the point of these lectures is that you have the job of reflecting on the state of affairs in America for African Americans. And I kept giving Skip these really abstract titles for these lectures, like Race and Justice in 21st Century America, or Voting Rights and Political Equality for African Americans in 21st Century America. And I also kept deferring the lecture dates. I kept postponing. And finally, Skip said, look, kid, you're going to have to give these lectures. And as I thought about this and, thought about Du Bois and that spirit he brought to understanding lynching, for example, in the early 20th century and understanding African-American experience, I couldn't possibly pretend to comment on the state of affairs for African-Americans without telling Michael's story. And that meant coming to understand it. So I said cuz means cousin, and it also means because. So why did he end up dead? Why was he in prison for so long? And for me personally, the hardest question, this beloved, talented kid from a family that loved him, that had resources within its extended range, why did he end up on a street corner at 15 holding a gun, trying to take somebody's car? How did that happen? So the book is an effort to answer every single one of those questions in the spirit of the gospel song that we'll come to understand it by and by. And there's a certain kind of liberation from that. But the liberation is not just personal, it's also about all of us. I'll just say one last thing, which is that you mentioned in your introduction that I'm an ancient historian as well as being a political philosopher. And the first book I ever wrote was about punishment in ancient Athens. And people think, who goes around writing a book about punishment in ancient Athens? That's sort of a crazy thing to do. But it does mean that I have seen, I think about punishment, over millennia and around the world. And so I can confirm that the world has never seen a penal system like the one we've built. Never. It's an American special. And we have to take responsibility for that and unbuild it. So it's not just in a sort of personal liberation, the story, it's an effort to help us all towards a collective liberation from this completely crazy thing we've managed to create.
That is so interesting, Danielle, because we are supposed to live in the greatest democracy in the world. And if you are studying ancient philosophy and history and punishment during those times, our democracy is supposed to be based on ancient democracies. So how is it in this experiment of ours, we've ended up in a worse predicament than the forefathers that came before us?
So it's just, it's sort of issue of a perfect storm, I think. Just how the way I got going writing my first book on ancient Athenian punishment was just I was this kid from Southern California. I grew up in Southern California in the 80s, where that's when prisons were exploding. And I wasn't self-conscious about that. I wasn't, as we would say now, woke to the issue. But I'm a living being, and I was registering the changes. And so I got to college, took this class on Athenian democracy. I was reading page after page of courtroom speeches, legal speeches and so forth. I'm like, there's something really funny about this stuff. They never talk about prisons. And it's just like, that was weird to think that it would be a society that people weren't talking about prisons. And so that's what sort of pulled me. I asked a question about it. My professor said that'd be a great dissertation, and that pulled me into it. But so, it was a very obviously different world. They could use exile, which we can't use. They also had a view about punishment that the expectation was its purpose was to restore social relations, to bring healing. They recognized anger as a problem in the community, and the point of the penal system was to heal anger for both victim and wrongdoer and try to put everybody in a place where they could move forward productively. So now we have a kind of restorative justice movement, and it has a lot of similar ideas and flavors to that earlier conception of punishment. But you asked a question about how we got where we are. And that is, I said, a perfect storm of the war on drugs, underlying American racial history, and the creation of forms of power and surveillance such as the world has never seen. And it's like those three things coming together establish a system of punitive control that is just, again, unprecedented.
I want to get back to those. So we're going to put those three items in the parking lot for a second, Danielle. Let's go back to your family. It was very interesting in reading the book, hearing about your family, that your father was one of 12. Michael's mother was the baby of the family. And, African-American families, because this is obviously my experience, our families are very tight as a culture. Yeah. And you feel a great sense of responsibility for others in your family, yep, especially when you may have gotten advantages that others haven't. Yep. Talk to us a little bit about Michael and his experience, because you do say that one of the questions you tried to grapple with is, how did Michael get here? Yeah. Because it is very troubling when you end up at Princeton, right, and Michael ends up somewhere else. Yep. So talk about that a little bit and what that means to the family. Yeah. So my dad was one of 12 siblings, just as Nicole said, and he grew up in northern Florida, a tiny little island off the coast of Florida. And half of the kids basically ended up in Southern California in the period of the 60s, where there's sort of another great migration out of the South of African Americans. And Karen was also one of those. She came after my dad and a couple of other siblings. So Karen was a single mother. She left the father of her 3 kids because he was physically abusive, and moved to California to be near other siblings as she tried to make a world for her kids on her own. And her story, it's just, one of the things I'm very grateful for working on this book was just the chance to talk with her at length about her story. Because I watched it as a kid. I saw how hard she worked, but to hear her tell it too is really a powerful thing. It's just really one of the hardest working people I have ever known. And so anyway, the whole sort of the ways in which single mothers get abused in our cultural conversation is really horrible, as you all know. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. So she worked her way up, got a nursing degree. Inch by inch, she was pulling her family forward. She got them into a little house in Highland Park outside of Pasadena, which is where Michael spent the years from 5 to 10. And he was this precocious, bright kid, did well in school, this gigantic, toothy smile that everybody loved. He was always bringing laughter and joy to spaces. Very curious. He loved to be outside. So he sort of also spent a lot of time climbing trees, climbing on rooftops, hanging out on rooftops, just like meditating and reflecting on the world, that sort of thing. And when he was 10, his mother met and fell in love with somebody and got married. And again, you're sort of like late 80s, everybody's sort of, single mom, go get married. That's what single moms are supposed to do to make their lives better, right? Well, this particular man that she married turned out again to be extremely abusive, and their lives just exploded. And over a 5-year period, they moved from California to Mississippi to Georgia, and then back to California to Claremont, where we lived, and then back into Los Angeles. And so this was between the ages of 10 and 15, and Michael had 5 mid-year school transitions. Like, these moves are not happening in July, like happening in October or April, like on a sort of regular basis. And that's really the period where everything went wrong, in the sense that he didn't have deep social connections in any of the places that he was landing. He was feeling abandoned in a variety of ways by the man that he too had fallen in love with. He had a close relationship to him, and so that was
a great loss. And then in the sort of last phase of this, they landed in South Central Los Angeles in 1994, so just a little bit after the LA riots. It was a really rough, hard place at the time. And it's very hard for a disconnected kid to land in the middle of the kind of urban strife and violence that that neighborhood represented at the time. And I can say more about then, sort of the last sort of 18 months before he got arrested and how he's getting sucked into trouble. But none of us saw the fact that he was getting sucked into trouble. That's one of the most painful things about it. So again, like interviewing family members, keep finding little pieces of information that everybody had, but we didn't talk about it because there's this sort of problem of shame that keeps people from talking about the little bits of trouble that you're seeing. So for example, I didn't know until I was well into working on this book that cuz has a third meaning. It's also what members of the Crips call each other. And Michael called me cuz, and he had started calling people cuz in those months shortly before he got arrested. And one of my cousins had noticed that and registered it as, Michael starting to flirt with gangs, but he didn't tell anybody. And similarly, everybody had a little piece of information of this kind, and nobody talked about it with anybody else. And so he needed help. He wasn't asking for help, and we weren't talking enough to see what he needed.
Danielle, you talk about, and you've mentioned here, how bright Michael was. You talk in the book about his smile. Tell us a little bit about, and he was quite young, obviously, as you've already said, when he went to jail the first time. Tell us a little bit how you saw him growing and developing, spending 11 years behind bars, going in as a 15, 16-year-old kid and coming out as what one would ostensibly call an adult. How did you see that impacting and changing him? And what role did the family play in trying to help ensure that despite the fact that he was behind bars, he was still receiving nurturing and love and care so that the family could help influence the kind of adult male he grew into?
Well, I wish I could say it was a sort of steady and all positive story, right? But it's not. It's uneven. And this is sort of to the issue of the ways in which these events are traumas for a whole family. So Michael's mother, as I said, she's an incredibly hardworking person, and the whole time that he was incarcerated, she was right there with him consistently, with one exception, which is that when he was 15, so when he was sentenced, the judge who sentenced him wrote to the corrections department and said, keep this offender in juvenile until he turns 25. That was the oldest age you could stay in juvenile in California at the time. Instead, for reasons that are completely inaccessible, when he turned 17, he was transferred to adult prison. And not only was he transferred to adult prison, but he's from LA, everything happened in LA. He was transferred to the prison in Susanville, which is right on the Oregon border in California. His mom could not get there. So he spent the first 6 months in adult prison without any family visits, which is, again, it's a terrible thing to say out loud and to admit in public, at any rate. And that was the hardest time. And so his mother describes him on the phone at that time as just this sort of very subdued, very quiet, slipping inside of himself, obviously isolated and scared and alone. And I'm sure, again, many of you know, when you do calls with people in prison, with incarcerated people, they're always surveyed, right? Everything's recorded and so forth. So there's not a lot of frank talk that happens over the phone. You have to register what's going on in people's voice. So, there was a sort of turning point for Michael when he was about 18, 19, where the way you register was he stopped asking for things. He stopped saying, I need, and he started every conversation with, how are you? Are you taking care of yourself? What are you doing for yourself? And so he really projected care, the project of care, toward other people, because he had, in some sense, become a person who was going to take care of himself, and he knew that nobody outside could actually take care of him on the inside.
What supplanted the family for Michael during those 6 months when he couldn't be in touch with you all, and thereafter? Because it's very clear in the book that the other methods of intimacy and relationship building that Michael latched onto had a very profound effect on the rest of his life. So tell us a little bit about those relationships.
Absolutely. Well, it's a little hard to say, with lots of specificity. There was certainly a point early on where he got connected with a lot of older inmates, lifers, and his language was, they're taking care of me. And so that was, his way of finding protection within a dangerous context. So, I think we can presume, especially in those first months of his transfer, that he was probably abused, sexually abused in various ways. And who knows exactly how his own romantic experiences developed in the early days. It's not something he talked about. But when he'd been in for about 8 years, he called me one day and said, "I've met someone, Danielle. She's beautiful." And I was like, "What?" I was like, "Does not compute." And I'm like, "What is it?" It took me a minute for me to understand that he was talking about a fellow incarcerated person, that he'd fallen in love, and he had fallen in love. You could hear it in his voice. I mean, there's just no question about it. And there was a contentment in his voice, and that relationship clearly carried him to a different place of stability and ease for the rest of the time that he was in prison. And it's funny because I said he was doing these college courses and writing these amazing essays. He loved to write. He was really talented. He wanted to be a writer. We always thought he would tell his own story. And so one of the losses when he died, not only obviously this person, beloved person, but was his voice. Like I have this box, sitting in my house with his letters and his essays. Sorry. At any rate, so what I was going to say was he was working on these college essays, and I'm like this academic nerd, and like he writes this great essay on Dante's Inferno. It's at the center of the book, right? It's like part of my purpose in the book, which is getting Michael's voice out. But he wrote this essay about Chaucer, about the Knight's Tale and the Miller's Tale. And the title of his essay was, 2 Tales and 4 Desires. And the whole essay is about how desire is unpredictable. It makes people do things they wouldn't expect to do, and it means you can't predict the course of their life because of desire. And I'm like, oh, good essay about Chaucer. Nice point about the Miller's Tale. I like how you interpreted this sentence, and so forth. And I did not get it at all, at all. And it was literally only when I was going back working on this book and I looked at the date of the essay and put it together with the date when he'd called me about Bree, as I call her in the book, because I changed her name. I was like, oh, like this essay is telling me about what it was like to fall in love. And that's a nice thing, to go back and be able to see that and to appreciate the quality of that experience for him.
I love the way you incorporated some of Michael's writings in the book. And I have to tell you, I was impressed. I was like, oh, he really gets Chaucer. I was impressed. And I thought, well, what could he do with Beowulf? So I was really impressed by that. Danielle, let's talk a little bit about once Michael gets the opportunity to come home. Because as we talk about our criminal justice system and how it's broken and what we need to fix about it, one of the most crucial parts is reentry.
Absolutely.
What do we do when people come home? So tell us a little bit about what not only what was in place, provided by the state, but then what your family had to do to try to complement that.
Right. So, there wasn't much in place from the state. That will not come as any surprise to anybody. I think for us, again, there are all these parts of this story and this book that are just sort of embarrassing. It's like back to the sort of the shame issue, things that are hard to admit. I'm a professional. My dad's a college professor. My brother's got a law degree. There are other members of the family who are professionals and so forth. And even we didn't figure out the system. Like we got blocked by it at every turn. And so you just sort of think about for people who don't even have access to the things that we theoretically have access to, it's a kind of conundrum of puzzles and riddles sort of nested inside each other. So for example, in our case, my then husband and I lived in Chicago. We were ready to take Michael into our home and have him go to college, living with us and support him while he did that. Another family set of family members in Riverside County in California were willing to take him in there if what he wanted to do was pursue the fire program. He'd been fighting fires as an incarcerated person in California prisons. So that was another option. And we're working on these plans, and then about a year before his parole date, we learned that you can't be paroled out of county. You've got to be paroled back into the county where you committed your offense, which means back into Los Angeles County for him. So sort of those two paths look like the most productive paths for him. And instead, he had to go back to the least productive path. So, I kind of, quote Donald Rumsfeld, and that was, we went to battle with the army that we had. Okay, so you had to go to Los Angeles, so we figured out LA Valley Community College had a fire technology program that looked like a good place to go. We looked for jobs close to the college and so forth, and then worked on the housing question. But it was definitely overcoming hurdles at every point, not, no facilitation. And maybe the last thing I would just say for a general answer is, I guess I haven't really told you all the full story here yet, but the kind of turning point for Michael was a point at which, he'd gotten a job, which was amazing, like 6 weeks after being released, and he'd gotten enrolled in LA Valley Community College, and we'd found an apartment not far from the school, and it was perfect, like teeny, clean, inexpensive, and these amazing landladies were willing to give him a chance, which is like an act of grace that should be a model to all of us. To this day, I am grateful to them. And there's this 24-hour period where we talked. We were going to come back the next day to pay the deposit. I was going to pay the deposit, guarantee his rent, and so forth. And he said he was going to take it. Drove him home, dropped him off. He called me like an hour or two later and said, "I don't want the apartment." I was like, "What?" And we went back. We had to sleep on it. Think about it. Come back to it. So then the next morning, he called me back on his way to work. He said he did want the apartment. And all day long, I was going to pick him up at the end of the day. We were going to go over and take the deposit. All day long, he'd call me like every hour and a half and say, "I don't want it. I do want it. I don't want it. I do want it." I'm like, "Hamlet, or what? Like, what's going on here?" And at the end of the day, he called and was very decisive and said, "I don't want the apartment. I can't imagine what it would be like if my associates came by there." I was like, again, I didn't ask questions. I didn't talk enough. I registered that word, but I didn't ask questions. And a few months later, it became clear that what he meant and what he was thinking about was whether to reconnect with Bree, his girlfriend from prison. And that was a choice he was making. And the point I'm trying to get to here about reentry is, I think we have a very unrealistic picture of what the experience of reentry is like. And so none of us in Michael's family were thinking about the challenge of choosing, for example, to give up the relationships that have sustained you in prison, which he did actually need to do. The relationship with Bree was ultimately not healthy. She's the person who shot and killed him in the end. She was in prison, as it turns out, for having tried to shoot and kill another boyfriend. So he did need to go in a different direction, but none of us were even supporting that part of the experience at all. Weren't even thinking about it.
Danielle, it's interesting when Michael said, "I don't want the apartment," the next morning, and you said you thought, what's going on, but you didn't ask questions. Why didn't you ask questions? Because my experience in my family is, no, you are taking that apartment or else nobody's going to help you live anywhere else because this is where you need to be.
Yeah, well, there was a little bit of that. But not the asking questions. And the reason, it had to do with this issue of he went in as a kid and he came out as a man. And it's like that hard, you don't want to treat him like a kid. You want to treat him like a man. Let him make his own decisions. And then there's the issue of the way he talked about it, especially the Latin. I can't imagine what it'd be like if my associates came by. I felt a kind of assertion of privacy and independence there. And I didn't feel comfortable challenging that. And that is something I wrestle with. Why did I not feel comfortable challenging it? Because I should have, obviously. If for no other reason, he still might have made his own choice, but I should have understood it. And my failure to kind of dig in deep enough to understand is what it is. It's a failure. It's sort of a human relational failure. But what I'm trying to do is also sort of tell the story of it so that we can see just how hard the work of supporting people through reentry is. It's you have to negotiate. He needed to be independent. He needed to be an adult. He didn't need me, being his boss mom, big cousin, completely. It's how do you negotiate that dynamic exactly? What is the right way of negotiating it?
So Danielle, you've already mentioned in talking about Bree, that Bree was responsible for ending Michael's life. So we know he didn't take the apartment. He went on to do some other things, and you talk about in the book how he did start community college, he did get a job, but eventually that all started to break down. and Michael came to the end of his life. He even got rearrested at some point. Tell us about some of those experiences and what led up to his death.
Yeah. So Michael came out of prison in June 2006 with hope. He did, which is an amazing and beautiful thing. If you've been in prison for 11 years, it's a bad thing. It's a bad, hard thing if you've gone in at 15 on a first arrest like that, for 11 years. But he came out with hope. And he brought hope into everything he was trying to do. His job search, his signing up for college. The hardest part was really this question of relationships and which relationships he could keep and which ones he had to give up and that sort of thing. And so basically, in some sense it's obvious, we're talking about LA, traffic is terrible, LA Valley Community College is, well north of the 10, his mother lived in South Central, well south of the 10. Once he didn't take that apartment, he had this massive crazy commute with no car in Los Angeles, it just wasn't gonna work, anybody could have told you that up front,
There's an Angelino laughing.
Yeah, no, exactly. So sort of, but he was making up his mind and he was making his choices. And so the first piece that fell out was the school piece. And then in November, so from June to November, he worked at Sears. He worked in the warehouse at Sears. And then he got into a fight with coworkers. So by his account, some Latino coworkers called him a nigger and they had a fight and he left the job and he never told anybody what happened. I heard his story. I didn't hear anybody else's story, so I don't know any other perspective. And so at that point, then now the employment thing is harder, right? Because he had a job and he didn't keep it and he doesn't have a good account of why he doesn't have a job anymore. So getting another job is going to be much harder. So he now is in a sort of world of odds and ends kinds of jobs, like picking up a little laboring here, a little laboring there, but not anything that kind of builds to anything else. And that is also the point at which he and Bree reconnected and committed to each other in some meaningful emotional sense. And by the end of sort of his first year out in May, what happened was he got into a fight with another one of Bree's lovers, and that fight sent him back to prison on a parole violation. So he was in prison for another year at that point. And when he came out the second time, he did not have any hope. So that second time in killed his hope. And so, when he came out the second time, he did more or less from pretty early on start living with Bree, whose world was a darker, more complicated place than the one that Michael came from, just as it happens, as a matter of chance. And so in the last few months of his life, they were getting more involved in criminal activity of various kinds, running drugs and things like that. And I have no idea what transpired between the two of them that led her to shoot him. It's not clear. There had been violence in their relationship in those last few months before that happened. Nobody really knows what the story is. And I didn't reach out to talk to Bree as a part of this book, which is a question, maybe I should have done, an investigative reporter would have done, but I didn't want to reawaken lines of connection between Bree and her family and our family. And so what I did do was get her court records to try to put her voice in the book too, to put elements of her story in the book and her perspective on what had happened between them. But that's the sort of the best I could do on that.
During the time when Michael and Bree were becoming even closer after his second incarcerative period, the period leading up to his death, how involved was the family even at that point? Was Michael still letting you all in?
So no, that's a great question. No. So by the time he came out the second time, he had really started to live in two separate worlds, and he was doing a good job of hiding his second world from his first world. So he was still spending a lot of time with his mother, but less and less time with his mother. And the most powerful way in which the fact that he had come to live in two worlds came out was that when he died, he had two funerals. So he had a funeral at his mom's church, which was, I kind of sort of describe it in the book, it's just like the kind of services that my granddad, Baptist preacher, used to do in southern Georgia when I was a kid, like really good old time, traditional gospel service, lots of ladies in big hats and that kind of thing. And then his own church, which was more or less a street church, and sort of like the street was there in the sense of rough people in trouble. The police were there working the funeral, they hadn't solved the murder yet, trying to figure out what's going on. It was like that kind of scene in contrast to his mother's church.
I want to start talking a little bit about policy and about the role of government in dealing with criminal justice. Before I do that, Danielle, I want to remind people, because I know we have people listening to us, that this is the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, and I'm Nicole Austin-Hillery, and I am moderating a discussion with Danielle Allen about her book, Cuz. Danielle, what is the role of government in this whole scenario? We're clear on what Michael's role is, and you have never, ever said,
Right.
my cousin didn't do anything.
Right.
You're very clear in saying Michael shares personal responsibility for what happened to him, but you're also very clear in saying that there are some things that the government has put in place, like sending him to a penitentiary that his family can't get to, like deciding to put him in a facility at a very young age where he probably shouldn't have been. What do you think all of that says about who we are as a nation and how we're making these decisions about our criminal justice arena?
Well, I mean, you know, I don't have to tell any of you. I mean, it's devastating what it says about our society and about our failure to understand justice in a rudimentary way, our failure to provide real opportunity and institutions of care to young people in particular, to leave young people vulnerable in all kinds of ways to dangers that we don't protect them from, and then they seek alternative forms of protection, which get them into more trouble. But let me maybe say a little bit more concretely. So I want to say two things. One is just to share a metaphor that I've started to use for thinking about the role of government, and then to say a little bit more about the war on drugs and what I think it's done to our society. So I don't know how many of you are, by any chance, fans of gymnastics? Anybody watch the Olympics last summer? A couple people. Yay, thank you. So you might remember there was a gymnast from India named Deepa Karmakar. And the coverage about Deepa was that she was going to do this vault maneuver, which is the highest degree of difficulty in all of gymnastics. And so the coverage is like, is she going to make it, or is she going to break her back? Is she going to make it, or is she going to break her back? Like, that's like, those are sort of the options. You either make it or you break your back. And I kind of feel like that's the situation for a lot of young people, especially growing up in the cities. It's like, yeah, like some people can make it, but like everybody else breaks their back. And the degree of difficulty confronting young people on the paths they find themselves on, that's what we as a society are responsible for. They are not responsible for that. Like the fact that they have a choice of like, you can make it or you can break your back. You know, that is not on them, that is on us. So then the question is like, how is it that we have built a society where the degree of difficulty confronting some young people is so extreme? And there are many, many pieces of the answer to that question, but one of them is certainly the war on drugs. And I just want to go through some of the ways in which it is, I believe, just totally corrupting of our society, like in our soul, like not just in our institutions. So lots of people, I just want to sort of back up for a minute and like just rehearse the way we often talk about the relationship between the war on drugs and mass incarceration. I mean, we'll point out, you know, all of the sort of nonviolent drug offenders who are in prison and so forth, and say, well, you know, if we release those, that'd bring the numbers down. And then people on the other side will say, well, that's only 14% of offenders. Like, and I say, well, I'll take 14%, you know? I'm not going to sniff at that. But even so, it's only the beginning of the story of how the war on drugs has damaged our society. So look at it this way. First of all, who here knows how much money Americans spend out of pocket on illegal drugs every year? If you know, raise your hand. Might be a couple. All right. This is a huge family secret, the fact that we don't know this. It's $100 billion a year that Americans spend every year for the last decade on illegal drugs, okay? So now, let's think about this for a minute. So how did the war on drugs work in the 1980s? First, one of the things that happened was scholars have been able to look back and see that roughly half of the drug transactions in Los Angeles, for example, involved gangs. But the police perception was that 90 to 95% of transactions did, which meant the war on drugs turned into a war on gangs. So what did that mean exactly? The state was attacking drugs by attacking street-level distribution, all right? Okay, now, just think about it for a second. If you have a $100 billion business and somebody's trying to stop your distributors, what are you going to do? You're going to fight back, all right? So think of the structure of cartels into the distribution system in the US. Most people buy drugs from people who look like themselves, okay, for whatever it's worth. It's an important thing to know. The drug business is an equal opportunity business. Drug use is an equal opportunity activity. But so what happens for the particular part of the business that's being targeted by the war on gangs is you get the combination of the cartels and gangs developing systems of sanctions and rewards to keep control of their street-level distributors. So you get a competition between the violence of the state and the violence of what I call the parastate, okay? And this makes cities very dangerous. Who is it most dangerous for? Kids, ages 10 to 14, all right? Because they're caught in the middle of this, and they need protection from it, and nobody's protecting them, except for gangs are offering to protect them. And that's what the sociologists have reported about how young kids do get pulled into gangs, that they get pulled in by the sense of a need for protection, and the idea that this is a place where they can have a group of people that'll keep them safe from other groups of people, all right? So the first point here is that the war on drugs itself has actually accelerated. The way we have gone after drugs has accelerated the rates of violence in our society, that violence has exposed young people to the need for protection, that we, with our laws and so forth, have not provided the protection that they need and left them vulnerable to further recruitment into this activity. And then, put on top of this, okay, I have a long list of things here, okay? So you guys have to just go with me here, okay? So, just to pick a random year, in 2013, 32% of new federal filings were drug charges, okay? That's a huge chunk of the judicial system, right? So prosecutors' workloads have been distorted by drug filings. Now, what's the consequence of that? Anecdotally, one argument that people make, and I'd be curious to know what you think about this, because you have more depth of knowledge about the research and statistics than I do. But anecdotally, so police, for example, report that prosecutors, because of extended workloads and so forth, when they're thinking about cases like homicide, are more likely to want the really open and shut cases, making it harder for the police to give them cases that aren't open and shut. And at least according to some police officers, this is a possible explanation for why homicide clearance rates in this country have fallen so dramatically in the last 50 years. So what's a homicide clearance rate? That's the rate at which homicide cases are closed, okay? Sometimes by an actual arrest and charges, sometimes for other reasons. But in the middle of the 20th century, homicide clearance rates all over the country were about 90%. Now, 50 or 60%, okay? And in Detroit, right before its bankruptcy, in the teens. Now, what does it mean when homicide clearance rates are that low? So this is where you get another little interesting wrinkle. It's not just that there's a certain kind of space where retribution starts happening more often. You get like sort of revenge killings and things like that. Some economists studying other places like Brazil have made the argument that what actually happens when you're in a world where somebody can attack you and go unpunished is that your best defense is a strong offense. And so you get a phase shift in the degree of violence in that space. A sort of a new equilibrium is the language that the economists use. So in other words, the war on drugs makes our criminal justice system swollen, shifts attention and resources away from the things that really need to be dealt with, namely actual violence. And the result of that is not just that things go unattended, but you get a whole phase shift up in the level of violence that you get in the places afflicted by that fall of homicide clearance rates, okay? Now, but there's more. I'm not done yet with the problems caused by the war on drugs, because here's another one, all right? Think about this one. So, in some places, simple use and possession of marijuana on the books at any rate can come with even a 6-month prison sentence, sometimes even a year prison sentence. Cocaine, crack, so forth, 1 year to 5 year punishments on the books for simple use and possession. Now, if your punishments for simple use and possession of drugs where a person's only hurting themselves are that long, what's going to happen to the rest of your punishments? They're going to have to get longer just to stay in proportion to those punishments. So a lot of people are in prison because sentencing has gotten so much longer. And mandatory minimums have been a part of that as well, sort of driving all that up. So I'm giving you like a whole lot of reasons, like $100 billion black market, that drives violence. Lower homicide clearance rates, that drives violence. So in other words, a chunk of the violence that's in our prisons, not just the nonviolent drug crimes, actually comes from the war on drugs, okay? And add to that the fact that sentences are longer also relates to the war on drugs, okay? And then the last thing I would put on top of all of this is, I asked you who knew how much we all spend on drugs, and we didn't know. And why don't we know? Because there's this massive culture of secrecy and deception and lies about drug use. And that corrupts a society in its soul. In its soul. And I honestly don't know how we can cure ourselves of this without just plain ending the war on drugs and being honest about the desires that this population has for drugs, the ways in which those desires often reflect mental health issues when people are self-medicating, and a whole lot of underlying health issues that we ought to see and understand and respond to as health issues, not criminal issues. Right? So sorry, now I've gotten myself into my rant on the subject, which is not exactly what you asked for, but.
And you're a professor, Danielle, so we expect this. A couple quick things. Number one, and I shared this with Danielle earlier, and I want to share this with all of you because we're talking about what can government do. There was actually a bill that was reintroduced in Congress today, in the Senate, called the Sentencing and Corrections Reform Act. And this is a bill that would do a couple things. It would help to cut down on mandatory minimums. It would put in place more leeway for judges to be able to look at an individual's circumstances separately, rather than saying, okay, well, you know, sentencing measures say I have to, if you committed this crime, I have to sentence you to this. It will give them some more leeway, and it also tries to address alternatives to incarceration. So this is a good thing. So we don't know where it will go in this particular political climate, but I do think it's important for people to know that there are people on both sides of the aisle in Congress who are trying to address this. But Danielle, the one thing you didn't mention as you were going through that list, and I completely agree with that list, is the big elephant in the room, and that's race.
Right.
There are people who, you know, some argue that the government is not so concerned about these problems because it's only impacting black and brown people.
Yep.
And I have a colleague, Rick Jones. He is the president of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers right now. He also heads Harlem Neighborhood Legal Services. Rick always has this anecdote that he shares, and I love it. And he says, you know what? If we started locking up more young white men, these problems would be resolved.
Yep.
So
yeah, if we had equal opportunity enforcement,
exactly,
alongside equal opportunity
so where does
use.
this issue of race fit into all of this?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. I mean, I sort of said to start, it's three things, right? It's the history of race in this country, it's how we've been fighting the war on drugs, and it's the massive increase in surveillance and militarization of police power and so forth that we've seen over the last 40 years. And it's these things working together. And without any question, I mean, Michelle Alexander has written really brilliantly about the way in which the war on drugs was racialized right from the get-go. And Operation Pipeline in the early 1980s was a policy whose purpose was to teach police to interdict narcotics on sort of the nation's roads and highways. And it was the way in which people were trained to do what we now call racial profiling. So the disparate enforcement of the drug laws was built in at a very early point. And yes, I mean, how is that a doable or a possible thing? It's doable or possible because of racial preconceptions that continue to structure the choices that people make in our society. So, I mean, I think all are very aware of this presently as we watch responses to the opioid crisis, right? Where with regard to opioids, it's very easy to convince people it's a health issue, not a criminal justice issue. So, you know, there are programs right now where, you know, you can seek help if you're an opioid user without fear of arrest, and it's advertised that you can seek help without fear of arrest. So I want to say, okay, well, doesn't equal protection mean that then, like, for other drugs too, you should be able to seek help without fear of arrest? Can we pursue that line?
14th Amendment.
Exactly.
I want to quickly ask you about going back to your discussion earlier about democracy and other governments in history, and I want to talk about our own can't have this conversation without talking about the government that we now deal with and who's in power. You know, one of the things that I know that you wrote a book called, and I'm got to look at my notes because I want to make sure I don't mess it up, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality in 2014. Say that fast 3 times, everybody. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Danielle, was how do you see the Declaration of Independence standing up in today's current climate?
So, I mean, the funny thing is that it was actually working on that book about the Declaration of Independence that made me a committed advocate of ending the war on drugs. So let me explain that, all right? Okay. In order to explain that, I have to give you a little bit of the Declaration. So just forgive me for a moment, okay? But you all know the beginning of this sentence, but maybe not the whole thing. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Now, I meditated on that sentence. It's one long sentence, okay? People don't remember how long that sentence is. A lot while I was trying to understand Michael's story. And when you read the Declaration, what you realize is that as they were trying to understand their own circumstances, and they made all kinds of mistakes, obviously, slavery, genocide of Native Americans, made all kinds of mistakes. But they got some things right, which is that as they meditated on their circumstances, they did try to figure out how the king's laws and proclamations were distorting their world and hindering their opportunity to flourish. So I was like, okay, let's just do that and think about which are the laws that are doing the most to hinder flourishing. In other words, we tend to start our policy conversations by saying rather, what things do we need? And we need health, and we need education, and we need jobs. Absolutely. But there's another fundamental question, which is, which laws are hindering flourishing? And the answer to that is the war on drugs. All right? It's like there's no way, when you look at those laws, there's no way the mandatory minimums, the criminalization of marijuana, and I would even say the criminalization of harder drugs too, I think they should be decriminalized, not legalized, but decriminalized. Those laws have distorted our society tremendously, coupled with the unequal enforcement of them, the racially disparate enforcement of them. We have got to root them out. If we genuinely want laws that secure our rights and effect our safety and happiness, those laws do not do that.
We're going to go to questions from the audience because I know people are anxious to ask you questions, Danielle. As people, and there are 2 microphones, I think on one, there's one microphone to my right and your left. And as people are lining up there, I want to ask you one last thing because I have that privilege.
You ask as many questions as you want from my point of view. I take them all.
You know, we're talking about race. We're talking about criminal justice. We're talking about disparities and fairness because you've commented on that on several occasions tonight. We'd be remiss not to talk about what is going on in the country right now with respect to Colin Kaepernick and the whole effort to bring more attention on the issue of disparities and our criminal justice system and racial divisiveness. Give us some parting thoughts on where you think all of this is leading us.
Well, you know, I mean, for me, okay, I'll have to admit at a personal level, the problem is rage, all right? I am very angry. And I have not actually always been very angry. I should probably have always been very angry. But now I am in a sort of day in and day out kind of way. And now the trouble with rage is that it's disabling. And so I tend to think a lot about one of my favorite writers, Ralph Ellison, and his book Invisible Man, which one of its beautiful features is that it's sort of an exploration of how you transmute rage into potency and efficacy. And I don't know where our world is going, but I do think that we all have a job to do of figuring out how to channel these really powerful and potentially disabling emotions into efficacious action, which usually means finding people to work with, building teams and groups and forming solidarities. And once you've got your group and solidarity formed, connecting it up with another one and building on that to restore people power and counteract the damaging kinds of institutional power that we are currently afflicted with.
That was well put. We're going to start taking questions. Now, I want to tell you all a couple things, couple rules about questions. Please make it a question and not a soliloquy. And keep it brief because we want to get in as many questions as possible. And I also want to tell you this about myself. I am not too discreet to not pull a Sandman on you. For those of you all live in New York, the Apollo Theater, Sandman used to come out with a hook, and he would pull you off. So I'm not afraid to pull you off, shut you down if you're going on a little too long, because we want to make sure we get as many people up here to ask questions of Danielle as possible. So we're going to start with this gentleman over here. And please tell us your name and your affiliation, and then your question, please.
How are you today?
Thank you.
My name is Wayne Marquez, and I currently own an educational software company, which is national in most of the inner cities throughout the country. Also started a nonprofit 26 years ago, which is quite large in New York City. I'm a graduate of NYU Law, and I've been wrestling with all of the things as far as inner city education. And it's interesting, you talk about mass incarceration. I think the process really starts a lot earlier before anybody gets to jail. And when I saw the thing, you guys were doing this thing on mass, I was like, great, we're gonna talk about the issue. And as I'm sitting here listening to the story and knowing tons of stories that I've lived through trying to help others, including my own, I realized that, and it's not discussed very often, I'm curious what your view on this is that you can't keep putting Band-Aids on something that doesn't have the legitimacy or representation of what our value system is or what we're trying to create. And as much as you can point to, I mean, we just had a mass murder, and we're talking about gun control, and we keep talking about small Band-Aids instead of, as a society, taking a step back and saying, what is it that we want? And that's where restorative justice, I think, is very good, and I know a lot of the schools I'm working with have been doing it, and it's a step in the right direction, but it's a step. And if we don't, as a society at some point, and I'm curious what your view is, stop talking about Band-Aids and start talking about what is our system supposed to do, and then start to figure out how we can create that through the laws, through many different mechanisms. But I think as we continue to have a discussion on the problems, I don't think we're ever going to have the change that's necessary, especially in this country. So
I agree 100%. And that, I mean, that for me, some parts, the reform conversation is completely necessary. I spend a fair amount of time talking to people about how to make juvenile justice better, right? How to think about rehabilitative forms of juvenile justice and so forth. But it's true that a part of that feels like you're just putting a Band-Aid on something, because there shouldn't be all those young kids ending up having to go through a juvenile justice system in the first place. Like, the problem is deeper and more fundamental. And that's where, for me, I know I feel like I may have a hard time convincing people, but I have come to believe that the first and most fundamental thing is actually taking apart the war on drugs. And for so many different reasons, because it's swollen the criminal justice system, as I've said, and budget dollars have flowed to the criminal justice system as a result. And that deepens and intensifies the police lobby, et cetera, powerfully. And So once you've got that there, it's very hard to take it out. And so what is that, when you swell the police lobby, and one of the things that they have been putting a lot of effort into lately is acquiring ever more significant and powerful surveillance equipment, more powerful weapons. So it's like we live in a police state and we haven't noticed. And the reason we live in a police state is because of the war on drugs. And I'm not trying to just produce a kind of reductio, just reduce everything to one thing here, because it's not as if obviously the economy and opportunity matters, but I deeply believe that the mistakes we've made with those laws are actually holding the economy down too, because we're losing so much talent, productive talent from the economy through the black market, and then through the school to prison pipeline that just picks people up so early and so forth. So I think all of these things are interconnected. But when you look at sort of the different sets of policy frameworks that came online, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth, the one that tracks the sort of increase in all of our areas of difficulty most closely is the war on drug policy architecture. It really is. And so I have come to believe, as I've tried to figure out which of these things is the most fundamental one, that this is the most fundamental one. Like that changing that would not be a Band-Aid. It would be about completely changing the heart of our system. Maybe I'll say one last thing there, which is that, again, it's a funny thing about political philosophy in the 20th century, that it has come to think that justice and politics start with economic questions. In antiquity, they understood that justice starts with criminal justice, that the entire shape of a society flows from how you handle crime and punishment. And we've kind of forgotten that. And that's what I'm trying to get people to see again.
Hi, next question. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you guys said there was one mic. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, yes, you can hear.
Oh, because that mic doesn't work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. No, no problem. We'll come back to you.
Hi, good evening.
Hello.
My name is Antonia Jeffrey. I am about a year and a half out of grad school, and I've been working on political campaigns, but I'm looking to get back into my graduate studies of criminal justice. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for writing such a courageous story, something that I think is both important to the political landscape right now, but also personal stories, especially in this time where from my particular neighborhood in Brooklyn, where a lot of people that my parents grew up with are now coming out of prison and are trying to get through this reentry system. So that's what my question has to do with. Someone close to me is currently trying to navigate the reentry system. So I'm thinking to ask if, looking right now, you can give Michael some advice on how to navigate reentry in the critical year after leaving prison. What advice would you give him? Which is also some advice that I'm looking to give someone close to me.
Well, to be honest, I think I would start with the advice to the people who love the person trying to reenter, and it's sort of the advice that you gave, which is like, ask the questions all the way down. In fact, push harder on the boundary between when you let an adult make their own decisions and when you tell them, look, there's a real problem here. I can see a problem up ahead of you. But most importantly, just to get people talking about what they're experiencing so that you have a fullness of the picture. And I think the third thing I would say is, and I've never seen this in a reentry conversation, having the conversation with people about their relationships, about which relationships matter to them and why, and which relationships bring them good things and which ones bring them bad things, and help them kind of do an accounting of their relationships and how to make sure they have a healthy set of relationships, which might be the hardest thing, because sometimes, we all know, like, the person you love the most is the person who does you the worst, right? And so, but not being afraid to bring that question of, who are the people in your life? And do you have to make some hard choices about these people? And if you do have to make hard choices, how the heck do we support you in relationship to that? And how do we fill those holes, rebuild in new directions, and so forth? And I think that sort of is related more to kind of bereavement practices I think we actually, need to draw on the wisdom of bereavement professionals to help people dealing with reentry.
That's really interesting. Had never thought about that. I'm trying to just gauge, because I'm getting my countdown. How many people over here are waiting to ask questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm talking too long.
Okay.
My
No,
answers
no,
are
that's
too
fine.
long.
And is anybody waiting over here? Okay, so here's what I'd like to do to try and make sure that you all get to ask Danielle your questions. I'm going to ask you to ask your question, and I'm going to ask Danielle to kind of give us closing. Yeah, I'll help you remember. And then I'm going to ask Danielle to give a closing statement that tries to address key points of what you all asked, and then Danielle, of course, to add in anything else you'd like to. So
Great.
let's do that.
Hi, my name is Rebecca. I'm actually a freshman at NYU. My question is basically that there's a lot that the government could do to change and to help policy, but what, as a young American, can you do to help change the system that we have in place?
Thank you, Rebecca.
Hi, my name's Aaron. I'm a 1L here. You spoke about decriminalizing marijuana. I'm curious if you could share more about the harder drugs. Would you also support decriminalization or legalization? And how would you address those who are distributing, especially in large quantities?
Thanks, Eric.
Hi, my name is Xiomara Rodriguez, and my family has been affected by mass incarceration. I kind of wrote my statement.
Oh, that's a long one.
No, it's short. So I view education as the source of liberation, and I wholeheartedly support this idea that we want to educate those currently in prison and those who have been released. So how do we begin to change the social narrative of the stigma that we continue to inflict on people who have already served their time? This idea of disenfranchisement, this idea of, having to check the box off. So how do we begin as a community to change that narrative and to help those, have been formerly incarcerated to educate themselves and become more productive members of society?
Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez.
Hi, good evening. My name is Larry Danielle Favors. I'm the General Counsel at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College and an NYU Law alum. I wanted to know, you spoke a lot about the socioeconomic diversity within your family. There were many of you who had means, and for some reason that was not a preventative for Michael entering into this particular reality. What would you suggest, especially as our current reality lets a lot of us know that economics are not going to be a protectant against racial injustice? What would you suggest that, is there a responsibility that Black families or African descendant families of means have to addressing these issues either prior to becoming involved personally? And if there is, what does that look like? And what calls and demands should the community be making or hopefully expecting or engaging in some sort of dialogue with that portion of our population in order to effectuate that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Octavia Milian. I am an attorney, and I'm also an educator in New York City public schools. So I'm a former prosecutor in Bronx County, and so I think you can imagine the kinds of things that I saw and heard. And I think that there's a direct correlation between education and mass incarceration. And I had the privilege of speaking to Pedro Nogueira about the school-to-prison pipeline phenomenon. And I truly believe that the restorative justice paradigm that's used in our present New York City schools is a racist paradigm, and as a woman of color, it greatly concerns me because I see it as a Band-Aid, and it doesn't address issues like mental illness, lack of basic amenities, and community-based organizations that help to provide support systems above and beyond that which are available in schools. So I see the school as a foundation, as a support system, and it's failing our children, and it greatly concerns me. And so how do you address and how do you feel about the restorative justice paradigm, especially in New York City public schools?
Thank you. Okay, Danielle. The role of young people in helping to reform our policies, legalizing drugs beyond marijuana, changing the social stigmatization for people upon reentry. How do we deal with economic inequality and the role of the Black family and Black community in changing this conversation? And then our last question about the educational system and what we need to do there, and how do we use that to help create change?
So let me start. Thank you. Can you come everywhere with me?
I love that, Danielle. I have to talk to my boss about taking time off to do that, but I'd love to.
That'd be great. So I want to start with the second one, actually, because I think it relates to the others. So I am very interested in the example in Portugal, where they have legalized marijuana and decriminalized harder drugs. Decriminalization means that what are currently felonies are basically turned into misdemeanors. And instead of getting incarceration, people get an alternative, like a halfway house or a therapy, medical services, health services, and so forth. And the resources of the policing system are directed at high-level traffickers. So to that specific part of the question. And Portugal has actually increased the quantity of contraband that it's been collecting this way, or taking. They have lowered, adolescent drug use has gone down, and more people are seeking treatment. So in other words, a different model could have very different outcomes. So then the question is, what do we do? Young people, what do we do? What do we do about schools, et cetera, and families? And I sort of think of it as like we've got two hands. We've all got two hands. With one hand, you've got to hold on to your own family as tightly as you can. And for me, that is about breaking through shame to make sure people are talking as much as possible about what the trouble actually is, and doing their best to coordinate care for young people especially. In schools these days, people are starting to do a better job of trying to have like data systems that permit different teachers to all enter information about a particular kid so that you have a fuller visibility into the kid's experience. And I think families need to just do something like that by talking more effectively. It's like that's like one hand, you grab your own family and you grab as many people as around you as you can too, like whether you're doing prison education or mentoring or volunteering, so you extend your circle of care. But that's just one hand. And then with the second hand, I think the thing that you have to do is get involved in politics. And so this is to that first question about young people. Got to elect representatives who are going to change the laws. Because I think one of the things that I find most painful is kind of like the Band-Aid question, is when you ask people to work their hearts out in a context where it's impossible to succeed. It's just cruel. And so you have to keep doing it anyway because you have to do your best to save your family and extend your circle of care as broadly as you can. But at the same time, we've got to simultaneously be working on changing the underlying rules of the game. And that's about changing laws, and that's about who we elect at the state level as well as the federal level. So one of the things I say to young people in particular is start paying attention to state politics again. Pay attention to your state legislators. Don't think that that's a boring area. Like that's actually the whole architecture of our criminal justice system. Most of it's at the state level, all right? It's like if we really want to do this work, we've got to re-engage in state level politics. So one hand, personal circle of care. Second hand, get active, get political.
That was a wonderful way to end our conversation. Danielle, thank you so much for joining us and for
Nicole.
sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you all for being here tonight. I have to tell you, every time I think about the world in which we live in right now, the political climate, the violence, and people ask me, how do you do the work you do in Washington every day? It's moments like these, it's looking around rooms like these. I am emboldened by thoughtful, caring people like you all. And I really am a glass half full person. I know that if we keep trying to figure this all out together, we will solve some of this.
Here. And if we let the stories come out, so if you've got stories, some of you said you had your own stories, lift them up. Lift them up. Let us hear them. Thank you.
Thank you all.